Thank you for joining us here on our Wednesday night Bible study as we're walking our way through the Old Testament. Tonight we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 8, a shift in the nation of Israel, whereas last week they had another shift spiritually. They're going to do it again tonight with 1 Samuel chapter 8. So let's look at verses 1 through 3. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So Samuel followed the law by appointing judges, as Deuteronomy 16 verse 18 says. It says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment." Now, he did appoint judges, but the judges that he appointed in Beersheba did not judge with righteous judgment. Now, as a side note, Samuel may have also appointed other judges in other parts of Israel, as that verse there in Deuteronomy instructs, but the focus here is on the sinfulness of his own sons as judges. And at first glance, this scenario of a judge appointing his sons as judges, and they turn out to do wicked things, it seems, merely to be a repeat of Eli's wicked sons. But Samuel is not Eli. You see, from the beginning, Samuel made distinctly different choices from Eli. For instance, he gave his sons Israelite names, while Eli gave his sons Egyptian names. It would also seem that though Samuel did appoint his sons to be judges, he did not surrender his own duties as a judge. You see, Samuel's home base was in Ramah, but he would also travel on a circuit at some point during the year to judge regionally. He traveled from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah. It was a route of about 30 to 50 miles in circumference, if the cities were in the locations we believe them to be. I mean, these towns were in the tribal regions of Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. And then he gives his sons, okay, so he's there, and this is where he's judging is in the center of Israel. He gives his sons the town of Beersheba from which to judge. Now look at this map. You see, down there at the very bottom, Beersheba is the southernmost point of the nation. It's fairly remote. Samuel is centrally located. You can kind of see his circuitous route right there in the middle of the map. Way up north at the very top of the map is Dan. That's the extent of Israel, from Dan all the way down to Beersheba. And Samuel judged right there in the dead center. So he chooses to send his sons down there to Beersheba, to the far reaches where their influence would undoubtedly have been minimal. Eli had his sons serve in the temple in the headquarters city of Shiloh. Eli's sons sought personal pleasure. Samuel's sons sought financial gain way down there in the far reaches in Beersheba. Look at verses 4 and 5. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Now it's believed here Samuel may have been somewhere between 65 and 70 years old, possibly at this point. The elders used Samuel's age and his son's sinfulness as an opportunity to request what their hearts really desired. It really seems as though the people were using Samuel and his sons as excuses to request the sinful thing that they really wanted. Samuel was not too old at all. Moses had been older, Joshua had been older, Eli had also been older. So it would seem that age itself was not necessarily the issue, though some have allowed age to dull their faithfulness. I mean, just take David, for example. Now, the elders were correct in their assessment of Samuel's sons, who were, in fact, faithless in their actions. However, Samuel's sons were all but exiled way down in Beersheba, where they could only have minimal influence. So again, the issues that the elders raised as reasons for their request do not pass muster. If anything, the rationale of the elders is lost and overshadowed by the final few words of their request, for they said that they wanted a king like all the nations. So there's the real issue. They want to be like other people who were all around them. The Lord had already told them specifically that they were not supposed to be like all the other people. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 26, "You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." Numbers chapter 23, verse 9, "For from the top of the crags I see him, from the hills I behold him. Behold, a people dwelling alone and not counting itself among the nations." So not wanting to be like all the other people around. And so rather than follow the Lord and mimic his nature and his character, the people want to copy the pagan, unbelieving people around them. And that's still a problem for the people of God today. Christians, far more than any would like to admit, desire and attempt to copy the pagan practices of the unbelieving people around them. Followers of God today need to strive to fight the internal struggle of imitating the world that surrounds them. The struggle is to be in the world and not of it, as Jesus prayed in John 17, 15 through 16. Look at 1 Samuel 8, verse 6. "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord." So Samuel was upset that the people had made such a request, but he should have known that it would come at some point. This exact situation had been prophesied in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 and 15. It says, "When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, 'I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me.'" Similar wording here. He said, "You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother." So Samuel's heart was greatly disturbed by the brazenly sinful desire of the elders of the people. They framed their request as Samuel's deficit, that it had left them vulnerable and in need. But in truth, Samuel had not been deficient. In comparison to Eli, we can see that the two situations are not the same at all. Eli's unwillingness to reprimand and remove his sons had resulted not only in their judgment, but his own as well. Now, Samuel does not face any such judgment, which would lead us to believe that neither the sinfulness of the sons was a recent development, or appointing them to Beersheba may have been a step in the process of accountability and correction. Maybe if they had repented and fixed their behavior, they would receive a better assignment than the extreme southern tip of the nation. For whatever reason, Samuel's actions do not seem to be viewed by God in the same light as did Eli's. So it can be assumed that at the very least, Samuel was doing something about his sons. This may have been part of what played into the amount of hurt that Samuel felt in response to their request. He's not only, Samuel here, he is only ever described as truly a faithful follower of the Lord. So as such, he does the only right thing in that moment. He turns to the Lord in prayer. Look at verses 7 through 9. "And the Lord said to Samuel, 'Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them.'" So Samuel, it would seem from the words of the Lord here, had felt personally rejected by the elders' request of a king. But the Lord seeks to reassure Samuel while also redirecting his thoughts to the reality of the matter. The elders' request of a king, like every other nation, was in fact rejecting the leadership of the Lord. They would rather be led by another created being whom they could see than by the Almighty Creator, whom they could not see. So God says that this has been a problem from the day that he rescued them from Egypt with incredibly miraculous works for all to see. They have been constantly seeking out other avenues of guidance and other objects on which to place their worship. It wasn't even as if the people wanted a king from the Lord. The people revealed their true desire. Rather than leadership directed by the Lord, the people simply wanted leadership that, at least from the outside looking in, resembled what everybody else had. This is, again, a problem that followers of the Lord still have today. They see the lives of other people, and from their perspective, everything seems great. So they covet other lives and seek to imitate the decisions of other people, only to realize, often too late, that there was far more going on than they had initially understood. And here with the Israelites, God tells Samuel to give the people what they want. This also happens in the New Testament. In Romans, Paul writes this. He says, "Therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." Look at verses 10 and 11 of 1 Samuel 8. "So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, 'These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots.' So Samuel listens to the Lord and obeys his instruction by warning the people about some of the consequences of such a request. By rejecting the Lord and seeking a human ruler, the people were rejecting the purity and sinlessness of the Lord in exchange for selfishness and pride. Whatever king they would receive would ultimately and sinfully lead according to his own will rather than according to the will of the Lord. This would result in a great many hardships for the lives of the Israelites that they would not have had to endure otherwise. But through Samuel's warning, the Lord wants the people to understand that all of these hardships will be self-inflicted if they really go through with this. Any king from the people would steal their sons and force them into military service that will most likely claim the lives of many of them. The anticipated lives under the leadership of the Lord would be intentionally abandoned for whatever whim falls to this king. The freedom that the people enjoyed under the Lord would be replaced by oppression and sadness. Families torn apart simply because of the people submitting to the sinful desire of their hearts. Robbing the families of their sons would only be the beginning of the consequences of appointing a king after the pattern of the nations around them. Look at verses 12 and 13. "And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers." So, if they appoint a king, he will create an army, meaning that the people will be taken off to war. And war would, in fact, become a consistent part of the people's lives, so much so that it was expected every year. By the time of David, only one generation away from this, the army went off to war each spring. 2 Samuel chapter 11 tells us this. And by that consistency of going to war is what got David into trouble. Maybe war had become so monotonous that he stayed home and he fell into adultery and he fell into murder. In addition, the king that the people here want to appoint, he would also take other citizens to work his fields. Maybe those people who were unfit for his army. Or maybe these people would be too old for the army or too young for the army. Or maybe they would be known to have special skills in the field. Then the king would task others with creating his weapons of war, those who would best create the most effective killing tools. Samuel continues and says that the king's conscription will not only consist of the sons of the people, the king will also take the daughters of the families in order to create perfumes for him and to cook for him. Samuel wants the people to understand that the people are talking about appointing a king so as to have the authority to do whatever he wants to do with the coming generations. Look at verses 14 and 15. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. So not only will the king take the people and their sons and their daughters, he will also take whatever the people cultivate and produce. At this point, up to this point, the people would not have faced this kind of royal taxation. If the people were faithful, they would have tithed from everything they had produced or received. But now Samuel's telling them that they will also be forced to surrender much of their produce to the king and his requirements. If the king were to build an army, have the support staff for his palace and for the army, they're going to need a food supply and a steady income to sustain all of that. And so that would require much from the people who, as of yet, had not had such taxes levied against them. Notice also that Samuel warns that the king will take the best of what the people have and of what they produce. Now, think about that for a second. To whom were they supposed to dedicate first and the best of what they had and of what they produced? The Lord. So rather than giving to the Lord as they were supposed to, their king would take what was intended for God as his own. It's also interesting that Samuel says that when the king confiscates their good produce, that he will give it to his servants rather than keep it for himself. Look at verses 16 through 18. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your flocks, and they shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. So the king will then even take the servants of the people to serve him and his needs. And he won't just take the most convenient servants. He will search out and take the best of all the servants. He will also take the best of their livestock to serve his purposes and his plans. Then Samuel makes an interesting comment that the people will be slaves to the newly established monarchy. So rather than committing their lives in submission to the Lord and his holy plans, the people will enslave themselves to their king. This is what was truly their rejection of the Lord as their leader. Samuel was telling the people that what they were really doing was more than simply appointing a leader. They were choosing to plan to submit to some other person before they would submit to the Lord. They would be placing the priority of the king and his plans and his requirements higher than the priority of the Lord. They would be, through their actions, considering their king as more important than their Lord. And this was the rejection of the Lord as their king. They were replacing their submission to the Lord with submission to their king. That's not to say that they had been faithfully submitting to the Lord throughout the years already. That's exactly what the Lord had said to Samuel back up in verse 8, that the people as a whole had been unfaithful ever since he answered their prayer of deliverance when they were slaves in Egypt. Look at verses 19 through 20. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Samuel had been trying to convince the people. He had been trying to warn them, merely about the beginnings of the devastation that having a king in this fashion would cause. But the people refused to obey. And this is often the case when we are warned against something that we really want to do. We refuse to believe the warning, and we walk headfirst into the trouble without second glance. Notice their wording here. Back up in verse 5, the elders had wanted a king like the other nations had. But here, they reveal that what they really want is for themselves to be like all the other nations. Their true desire is to become like all of the nations, at least as they perceive the other nations to be. They wanted what they thought all the other nations had. They wanted a human king who would exact justice, who would protect them, and who would fight their battles for them. The true tragedy of the ignorance of the request of the people was that they already had what they were asking for. The Lord had already promised to go before them and fight their battles. Deuteronomy 1 verse 30. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. Deuteronomy 3 verse 22. You shall not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you. Deuteronomy 20 verse 4. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory. You know, it makes me think of a kid asking for a toy at Christmas that they saw a friend have or they saw on a commercial, but they already have a toy that does all of the things better, and yet they want what they currently do not have. Look at 1 Samuel 8, verses 21 and 22, finishing out the chapter. And when Samuel heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go, every man to his city. So Samuel again demonstrated the great faithfulness that his predecessor did not have, and that really defied the accusations laid against him. Samuel did not answer the people. The people had come with grievances, and the people had come with a plan, and Samuel did not defend himself. He went to the Lord seeking an answer. He knew how he felt. He knew what he wanted to say, but he still went to the Lord for what needed to be said and what needed to be done. Then when he told the people what the Lord said, they responded in selfishness. They responded in disobedience and sin. And still Samuel did not say what he undoubtedly was thinking. He did not air out his own opinions. He did not lash back with his own set of accusations, as we are wont to do when we are hurt and when we are offended. Samuel, again, went to the Lord. His answer to even the most overt and heinous acts of defiance was to go to the Lord before he said what was on his mind. The Lord would give the people what they wanted, and it would turn out far worse than they ever had anticipated. But if we only would follow the example of Samuel by turning to the Lord in the face of whatever comes against us, before we open our mouths to say what we are thinking in the moment, how would our lives and relationships be different if the people of God started acting more like Samuel and went to the Lord? So thank you for joining us here as we've been examining 1 Samuel chapter 8. Join us again next week as we continue studying God's Word.